Now there are a multitude of adjustments available across all three pedals, and that's one of the things that I loved about my previous set of Ultimates, was just how much fine tuning there was available to not only dial into my own personal preference, but to the different styles of cars, and so simulating the types of different cars that are out there, from street cars all the way through to Formula style and GT style race cars. Now, what I wanted to do here is a little bit different from what we normally do. I actually want to try and integrate the manual into this process a little bit as well. And what I would recommend is, if you are looking at buying a set of these pedals, actually go and download the manual from the support section of the Heusinkveld website for yourself, because this manual is exceptionally well written and it really does take you through every single little detail and exactly how to adjust it. And I think it's a good idea to establish an understanding of all this stuff before you actually receive the product. That way you can kind of just dive straight into it. You kind of already know what you're doing, and it's not such a steep learning curve that takes away from the joy of, you know, getting these pedals up and running and driving straight away. So let's just quickly thumb through the manual now. You can see clear descriptions of each of the adjustments that we have available, as well as graphs that are actually mapping out the force and how it applies, whether it's in a linear or non-linear fashion. We can go through here, clutch pedal force, again, graphs that demonstrate everything. I mean, the amount of detail that they go into here, even one little thing I noticed was he mentioned that when you undo the bolts for adjusting the pitch of the pedals, you know, you don't have to worry about the whole thing falling apart on you. And I think this is really important, because a product like this can be quite overwhelming, and you can kind of be left wondering whether you're actually getting the best experience out of it, simply because of the amount of stuff that you can change. So reading through this, for me at least, really kind of fills me with the confidence to know that I am going to be able to dial it in for the best experience. So we'll keep going here. Again, this is through to the brake adjustments here. Now you can see the 9 different adjustments that we have between hard and soft springs. And even just here, there's a visual diagram of exactly how that's configured. So yeah, a massive amount of detail here. And I would once again recommend that you guys download this if you're looking at buying these pedals and getting across it yourself. You can see there an exploded view as well that shows how the assembly goes together. Really, really good stuff. And yeah, something that I really do think sets this apart from other products that we reviewed here. So let's take a more detailed look now at the mechanical adjustments available on all three pedals. So as we mentioned earlier, all three pedals have the same adjustment when it comes to pedal angle or pitch. So we have that 15 degrees of tilt as we demonstrated earlier. As we mentioned before as well, we can adjust our pedal plate. So let's just quickly demonstrate that. So we'll grab our Torx key. Now, one thing I did notice, it wasn't mentioned in my notes, is that they are now using a Torx bit for these pedal faces. So on the set that I had, at least, it was an Allen key previously, and I did have an issue with that stripping out on one of my pedals. This probably has been updated for a long time now. It's probably not something that's unique to the Ultimate Plus, but it was something that I noticed that had changed since my early edition Ultimates. So we're gonna undo the little nut on the back here. Simply unscrews. So it's just a standard little nut there, not a nylock or anything. And then the bolt slides out, like so. And then we've got our pedal face. You can see there's a little notch there as well. And then we've got our hole, which is countersunk for mounting the actual screw. And then if we have a look at the face itself, you can see our 3 points of adjustment, and there's a 13mm difference between the 3 of them. So in the bottom position, I'm just going to be careful to line this up properly. So there we go, bottom position, that is 252mm high. Then we go up to 265, which is the default position, and then we can go up to 278mm, which is again another 13mm increment. So we're going to set that to the middle position where it was. That is perfectly fine for me. Simply pop the bolt back through the front, and nut goes back on the back, and we're good to go. So same adjustment across all 3 pedals. Obviously the height is slightly different for our throttle pedal, as you can see here, but otherwise the adjustment parameters are the same. So next up, some adjustments which are unique to the throttle and clutch. So we'll set our brake aside and let's have a look at these guys. So with our throttle and our clutch, we have the ability to adjust our pedal travel. So the amount that the pedals push down. A little bit harder to push the clutch here on the table, but you get the idea. We can also adjust our overall pedal force, or the amount of force that's required to actuate the pedal, and our pedal spring preload, which is the adjustment for the spring tension here. So pedal travel is a very simple adjustment. As we saw before, the little blue urethane bushing, all we need to do is just loosen off using the included Allen key, the 2 little bolts, just crack those. And then with those bolts adjusted, all we need to do is simply slide forward to reduce the throw, or slide back to increase the throw. It's a little bit difficult because that bushing is squeezed in there quite tightly, but just pull it back all the way forward. And you can see now we have a much larger amount of throw there available. I'm going to actually set it back to close to where it was. I think that their factory preset is pretty good. Now, one thing just on that note that is important to take note of is the fact that these are pre-calibrated from factory. So as soon as you make any adjustments, you will need to go back in and calibrate them again. But obviously we're going to do that as part of this video anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But just so you know, if you do fiddle with them, you will need to recalibrate. So just make sure it's nice and straight. And then once we're happy, we can tighten that back down. So next onto spring preload for, again, the throttle and the clutch. This is unique to just these two pedals. So again, we'll work on the throttle pedal here, but it is exactly the same in terms of preload for both pedals. And just referring to the manual here again for the explanation on exactly what this does. By making the spring length in the rest position shorter or longer, you change the initial amount of force required to move the pedal. The slope of the force curve will remain identical. So it's just adjusting the amount of initial force needed to get that pedal moving, but it doesn't change the linearity of the force that's applied as the spring compresses. And that makes sense because it is a linear spring here. It's not a progressive spring. So it's not going to change in characteristic as it compresses down. So what we do is we take our 10mm little shifter here, or spanner that was included in the box. We loosen off our retention nut like so. And then all we need to do is just wind in or wind out this little collar here. Winding it in increases the preload. Winding it out decreases the preload. We obviously don't want to decrease it to the point where the spring becomes non-captive. And what I mean by that is if you were to wind it out too far, and I don't know whether that's actually going to even be possible on these pedals, I'm guessing probably not. But if we wind it out all the way, you can see there, even with that preload wound all the way out, our spring is still captive. It's not rattling around inside there, and it's still sitting firmly on the spring retainer or the spring perch that we can see just on the back of the adjustment knob here. So that's as simple as that for preload. And again, what that's doing is it's just changing the amount of initial force required to get the pedal moving. So I'm going to set that back to roughly where it was from factory again. I do like to sort of start off with factory settings as they recommend you go, and then make any adjustments from there. So we're just going to tighten down that little locking nut again as well. And if you want to, before adjusting these things, you can put a little mark there with a permanent marker, for example, so that you have a reference point, you know exactly where it was from factory. If I was smart, I probably would have done that before I adjusted things, but too late now. Now, just quickly on that, once you have made your adjustment, the manual suggests you also check the little nut here to make sure that's nice and tight up against the eye here. So let's just quickly do that too. I don't think that that would have come loose. Yep, that's fine. So we are good to go. Obviously, you just want to make sure that all these things are tight, because anything that's loose will work its way free and move around when you're driving. And anything that is loose and moves around is obviously going to change how the pedal feels over time while you're driving. And muscle memory, as we know, is extremely important when it comes to pedals, particularly with the brake pedal. So anything that's changing while you're driving is obviously going to ruin that muscle memory and make it a lot more difficult to be fast and consistent. So next up, we have our throttle and clutch pedal force adjustment. This is a little bit different between the two pedals. So we're going to set our clutch pedal aside now and just focus on the throttle pedal. So this is going to be made by adjusting or loosening off the two little bolts here, pretty much exactly the same as what we did on the lower bolts here. What we do need to pay attention to here though, is that we don't remove the bolts entirely, because if we do, there is an assortment of little washers and bits and pieces inside here, which can fall down, and it's going to be really difficult to put this back together again afterwards. So to save yourself the hassle, just loosen them off enough that you can adjust it up and down. Don't loosen it off entirely. Now, if we have a look at the manual here, we can see once again a very convenient force graph here, which explains the relationship between the amount of travel and the amount of force that's required. But essentially what we're doing here is changing the slope of the pedal force curve. In the highest position, you'll need more force to reach the end of the pedal travel compared to the lower setting. It also slightly raises the overall amount of force required. So the procedure for adjusting the pedal force on the clutch is a little bit more involved. We have two sliders this time instead of just the one. So what we've done is loosen off the two bolts, one on either side here. And again, we don't want to remove these because we don't want to have the assembly collapse from the inside. It's going to be a pain to put it back together again. And then same deal with the two bolts just in this position here. What I also would recommend is loosen off, make a little mark where your preload was set if you wish to, and then just back off your preload until that spring becomes non-captive as well. As you can see here, that spring's now rattling around freely. Releasing that spring tension just makes it a little bit easier to move things around without scraping up your brand new pedal. So essentially what we have here is an adjustment which raises or lowers this entire assembly, as we can see here. So in the bottom position as it's set now, so bottom here and top here, that is our softest setting. And as we move that up through medium and then strongest setting at the top. So you can imagine now it's going to require quite a bit more force to push that pedal in than what we had at the bottom here. So I'm going to leave that in the default position for now. But what you do need to make sure you do here, however, is raise or lower in proportion front to rear. So we don't want to end up twisting it. That's going to cause other things to kind of go out of whack here. So we're going to lower that back down to where it was. I'm going to tighten that up again. And then we can move on to the curve adjustment. So having a look at the manual again, we can see a nice graph which demonstrates the relationship between foot force and travel percentage. But we also have an adjustment here for our pedal force curve shape. And this is what gives us that two-stage effect with our clutch application. So as any of you who have driven a real life manual car would know, when you push the clutch down, there's kind of a second stage where the bite point is. And this can vary quite a lot from car to car, which is often the reason why somebody who's very experienced with driving one manual car might jump into a race car, for example, and find that they stall it the first couple of times that they try to launch. So what we have here is an additional adjustment. And this allows us to adjust between the typical kind of feeling that we'd have in a street car and of course a race car. So if we have a closer look here, as I push the clutch pedal in, you can see the spring compresses. And then as I get close to the maximum threshold, this whole assembly kind of pivots upwards. Now you can imagine here, if we adjust the position throughout these 7 holes, that's going to influence the curve here. And again, if we have a quick look at the manual, you can see a graph which demonstrates the most concave versus the flattest effect here. So we can't dial it out entirely, but we can reduce the effect by about half here, from 16 at maximum down to about 8 kilograms of force required. So we'll pop that back out of the way. So what we need to do is again remove the 2 bolts. We can remove them entirely this time around. It's just a washer and then a bolt going through from the backside. We do want to remove the preload from our spring as well. Then we simply move this assembly up to the top for the maximum effect or down to the bottom for the minimum effect. Again, from factory it's set to somewhere in the middle, and I'm going to start off by testing it in that position, see how I feel about it, and then make any adjustments as I see fit. But again, as was the case with my original Ultimates, just the pure range of adjustability that we have with these pedals really is outstanding. And I'm absolutely certain that regardless of what kind of feel you're trying to achieve, you're going to find something that's going to feel right for you with this clutch pedal. Okay, so onto our brake pedal now. The adjustment that we have here is brake pedal resistance, of course, and there's a huge range of adjustability. But before we get into that, I just want to touch a little bit more on exactly how this design works, because it's fundamentally a little bit different from what we have with the throttle and the clutch. Remember before we talked about that little tiny spring which exerts a varying amount of force on the tiny little load cell. In this case, we have a massive 200 kilogram load cell. These pedals are designed for a maximum force of 140 kilograms though. So don't go thinking that just because it's got a 200 kilogram load cell, you're going to be pushing to 200 kilos. The rest of the design here is obviously intended for 140 kilograms of force. So if we flip it around here, you can see the big chunky load cell on the back here, and you'll notice that the assembly on the back here is a separate piece to the front. So what happens is as we push the pedal down, the force comes through the elastomer springs, through the little metal spring here as well, and we'll explain the relationship between those in just a moment. That force is then pushed through into the load cell. What then happens is you get a slight deflection between the back half of the load cell and the front half of the load cell. So you can see, because these two halves are separate, as the back end pushes down, we can measure that differentiation between the two. So that slight deflection in the load cell is of course caused by the amount of force being applied to the pedal. That is then converted into a variable voltage. That variable voltage is then interpreted or amplified by the little control box and fed into the sim as braking pressure, which is then applied within the game or the sim that you're playing. So it's important to understand that the force detection as far as the load cell is concerned and the signal that's being outputted into the PC is linear. You can of course modify this to be non-linear in the smart control software should you wish to do so. But essentially what we have here is a 2-stage system which is designed to simulate what actually takes place when you push the brake pedal in a real life car. So you'll notice the little metal spring here, that is actually designed to take up that initial slack in the brake pedal. And when I say slack, I don't mean slop, and you'll notice there is absolutely no slop in this pedal whatsoever. But in a real car, when we push the brake pedal down, there's always an initial little bit of take up, as it's called, between the pads and the actual brake disc or rotor. So when you push the pedal down, there's a little bit of actuation or a little bit of force that's applied, which doesn't have a whole lot of resistance behind it up until the point where the pads actually start to interface with the brake disc or the rotor. And that's when the braking force actually starts to be applied to the vehicle. So what this little spring is doing is actually taking up first. So we push down on the pedal, We can see that spring will compress first, and you can calibrate this to either, apply a little bit of braking pressure the moment you start to push down on the pedal. But what most people do, and what's most accurate relating to a real life car, of course, again, depending on the type of car, is to have a little bit of a dead zone there. So you do have that little bit of initial take up where the pads aren't quite interfacing with the rotor yet. And then once that spring is fully compressed, that's when you actually start to apply brake pressure inside the car. So it gives you that nice little bit of control or feeling in the initial bite of the pedal. Now you'll also notice if you have a look inside here, there is a little stopper here too, and that is designed simply to limit the maximum amount that we can compress that spring. So once that stopper reaches the metal part at the back here, it's not going to compress in any further. And then of course all the remaining force has nowhere to go but through compressing the elastomer springs up here. And then from there we can adjust the amount of pedal travel as well as the pedal resistance by adjusting the elastomer inserts that we have in our rubber stack here. We also do of course have a preload adjustment too, which influences the rubber stack. But what I would generally recommend is swapping out the elastomer inserts and then fine tuning with the preload later on. You don't want to be compensating for a massive amount of adjustment by putting a whole ton of preload in there, because that's going to be putting a large amount of tension on these elastomer springs all the time, which is just unnecessary. So as we mentioned before, we have 9 different combinations which you can use to achieve the pedal feel that we want, and then we can adjust the preload slightly on top of that to really dial into exactly how we want it to feel. Now there are set combinations here which we do need to adhere to. If we do go outside of that range, if we use a weird combination of spacers and elastomers, then we can cause damage to the product. Remember, as we mentioned before, the elastomers are designed to maintain their integrity over time and not blow out or lose their strength. But of course, if we are pushing outside those design tolerances, then problems can occur. Now, what we get inside the package, as we saw before in the unboxing, is a couple of little elastomer springs as well as a bunch of spacers. So all of the elastomers are marked as such. So we can see here 37 HE soft, 19 HE soft, and 28 HE soft. And then we have the spacers here. The ones that are installed by default are the harder springs. And again, if we reference the manual here, we can see we do have a list of all the different combinations, as well as exactly what they should look like once you've put them into the stack. So you can see here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spacers. Then the thicker spacer, our 19, another spacer, and then our metal spring. And we even have another force gauge here where you can see foot force in kilograms, up to 140 kilograms, as we mentioned before, or 280 odd pounds. And then the amount of travel in the pedal relative. So you can see here X and Y are our softer springs, and then A, B, C, D, E, F, and G related to our combinations here. So again, very self-explanatory and very, very easy to kind of get an idea of what you might like before you go and adjust it. Now, it's not too difficult to change out by any means, but it's good to have a reference like this just so you're not shooting completely in the dark from the onset. So the way we adjust this, let's just pop the manual out of the way. We wind off the preload, so you may need to loosen the little retention nut here first. I didn't need to, so just tighten it a little bit, loosen it off there. Loosen off any preload that we have in our elastomers to the point where they become non-captive. So we should be able to see them rattling around there now. We can see we've got our 4 spacers, our spring, and then our back plate. So all we need to do is simply slide this forward slightly, tilt it up like so. And we need to pay really close attention to exactly how this was arranged, because obviously if we get it wrong afterwards, we could cause problems. So we've got our back part, we've got a little spring perch, and I'm going to set these out on the table in the order that I pulled them out just so I don't lose anything. We've got our spring, we've got our stopper, then we've got a combination of spacers and springs. So if we pull one of these off, you can see on the top there, 37 HE hard. And we can change that to be whatever combination we want. So again, if we look at that, we could, for example, have 1 hard spring and then all the rest filled out with spacers should we wish to do so, or whatever combination you want. You get the idea there. And what I would recommend is, again, referencing that guide to sort of get a feel for what you think you might like, and then just adjusting this to your personal preference. But again, it is something that's nice and easy to adjust on the rig itself. You're not going to need to take the pedals off your rig to make these adjustments, which is really important. So let's put this back together again, remembering again how we had it all laid out. So we'll pop our spring back on too. And we want to pay extra careful attention here that our spring does actually sit over the spring perch here and not squished on the side. It is easy to drop down if you're not careful. Back piece goes on, and then the whole assembly just rotates down like so. Back into our retainer here. And then we just wind in our little bit of preload again. Now it is really important to make sure we do have enough preload on this, as well as making sure that we do tighten our little retaining nut here with the included spanner as we saw before.